Okay, so welcome everyone. I am Karen Tongson. I'm the new chair of Gender and Sexuality Studies here at USC and a professor of English, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and American Studies and Ethnicity. And before I introduce our guest speaker and begin our event today, I'd like to acknowledge that our presence here today is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. And that USC exists on occupied land. So I've already introduced myself, and I'm really so excited to see so many of you joining us, not only from our Gender and Sexuality Studies community here at USC, but also from out there in the world, in our community, and across other institutions. It is my distinct pleasure to have a conversation in book club today with the founder of Project Q, Madin Lopez. And Madin was born and raised here in Los Angeles, began doing hair in high school. You're going to learn more about their story as we move on. But the reason that Madin is joining us today is because they are someone who has employed emergent strategies of their own, as well as some of the principles that we learned about in Adrienne Maree Brown's book, to fulfill their life's mission to help LGBTQIA plus youth by forming Project Q, which they're going to talk about in a little bit. So I'm going to introduce Madin, let them talk a little bit about themselves. I'm going to also say that one of the ways in which I met Madin was actually in a moment of a kind of exemplary moment of finding queer community amidst loss. My hairdresser, who was a trans Black woman who had her own salon, became ill and passed away. And, it was a long-term relationship. We don't think about all the people in our community with whom we have long-term relationships, especially those people who are sometimes considered or relegated to doing service for us. But Vanessa was my friend and my therapist, as I said, a therapist of sorts. And when she passed away, I was at a loss to find a place. And somehow the universe, the world, and the LGBTQ community here in LA brought me to Madin Lopez. And that's how we met. And now I guess that's about 6 years ago now. So our relationship too has grown over a long period of time. And then I got to learn about Project Q and the other work Madin is doing in the world. So I hand it over to them. Madin, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Karen, it's interesting. I knew that that's how we came together, but for some reason, it feels like we've been together for so long that I had completely forgotten that little bit. And I think that that's such an important thing to remember, right? Is that simple thing. That therapy, right? That you're sitting with someone and they're seeing you for who you really are. And so that's how Project Q actually started, is that I wanted to be able to see people. We started at the Queer People of Color Conference at CSUN in 2012. And I started doing haircuts there just for the young folks that were coming to the conference. And the first time that anyone came and said, please just shave my head. I'm gonna come out to my mom when I get home from this conference. I wanna be seen as myself. And I shaved their head, and the way that they looked at themselves, it looked like they were seeing who they were for the first time in their lives. And I decided that that's what I would want to do for the rest of my life. And so we started Project Q that day, and we moved from the conference to doing haircuts within homeless shelters and doing haircuts for homeless LGBTQ youth of color. Then we had a mobile self-esteem salon that we took across the country and did haircuts for people across the country. And now we have our brick and mortar space in Chinatown, Los Angeles. And Karen has seen that growth over the years and how we have shifted and changed. But the main thing that I'm recognizing now, especially with this talk and rereading Emergent Strategy during a pandemic, right, where the in-person thing that I'm used to giving people is no longer really existent, I'm having to see what is it that I'm actually giving and what is my actual worth. And really it's skipping the haircut and getting to the community and being able to have conversations and representation with the youth that we service. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, and I think that, I think it is important too, to acknowledge that usually we be gathering together. There's this kind of a sense of conviviality being in person, but we've had to forge these remote intimacies. And one of the things I think that is most striking, and some of you may have seen this as you'd seen the various forms of announcing this event and publicizing this event, is one of the quotes that we shared, the USC GSS event shared on Instagram from Adrienne Maree Brown's book. And it is about, figuring out these forms of resilience, figuring out amidst confronting a world that looks broken and seeing the possibility and wholeness in it. And I think that, this gathering is in many respects an effort to forge that, to see how, people have brought emergent strategy, different forms of mutual aid, and also the different kinds of resilience that, and that's a key word of this book, have been modeled in, not only this book, but in these different activist mutual aid communities and organizations, and brought them into practice. And I hope that we as a community, related to USC, at USC, and also outside of it, can find a way to do that together as well. And, one of the things that I also know about you, Madin, and this has come from our different conversations over the course of time, is that your love of science fiction and speculative fiction, and especially Octavia Butler. And Octavia Butler, as all of you who read it know, is really such a key figure of emergent strategy. The active imagining, the kind of, uncanniness of the worlds that she had the ability to imagine that are a bit frightening and all feel too real right now, but also that becomes the seed of inspiration, the earth seed of inspiration for some of the material in Adrienne Maree Brown's book. And so I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about your relationship, Madin, to science and speculative fiction, the imagination of building new worlds, and how that factored into your approach to trying to create a community organization or a kind of new world of your own.
Yes, you caught me. I'm a big Octavia Butler fan. And it's interesting, when I first read Emergent Strategy, I was reading the Parable series. And this time when I was rereading Emergent Strategies, I was reading Wild Seed. And so these are kind of, all of her books exemplify Blackness and Black femininity and its spectrum within power, but not power that is given, or that power that is not seen as a positive. And so just sitting in that and understanding where we are now, and realizing that we literally have to imagine what our future might look like in order to make it real. Like, that is speculative fiction. What she's saying in Emergent Strategy, and what Octavia talks about constantly in her books, is let me imagine what the world might be so that I can create it. Because if I don't imagine it, I don't see it in my everyday life. I don't see a representation of what I want to be. I also don't see a way out of where we are. So I have to use my imagination and create something for ourselves. And so I applied that within what we do here at Project Q. It's really, I never thought that I would be able to have a community space where our youth come and are able to feel seen and loved. Now that we can't use that physical space, we're now having to imagine, what is the next step? How do we keep the connection with our youth, and how do we keep them strong? Because similarly to in Parable, she gets pregnant at a certain point, and it's like, what is she going to do for her future? She has to imagine that it can be better, right? So she's thinking of the future. And I feel like that's the space that we should all be embodying at this time. It's what we try to do here. When I'm speaking to my board of directors, I'm sure that they think of a lot of what I'm imagining as fiction, because I'm imagining what we can possibly create at every end without the one thing and comfort that I'm used to being able to offer. And so, I'm thankful that I have a history of understanding that so that I can apply it to our circumstances.
And I want to just point everyone to page 19 of the introduction, as a real crystallization of these ideas that we've just been talking about, being transposed as they are from the speculative fiction of Octavia Butler to a certain degree into a pragmatic, approach, a truly pragmatic approach to what to do when confronting and being mired and feeling lost in a world that seems impossible to navigate, as we must feel, especially again today after the recent events of the last week, which we're kind of stuck in this eternal repetition. Anyway, this is the quote at the top of page 19. We must imagine new worlds that transition ideologies and norms so that no one sees Black people as murderers or brown people as terrorists and aliens, but all of us as potential cultural and economic innovators. This is a time travel exercise for the heart. This is collaborative ideation. What are the ideas that will liberate all of us? And I think that's a really fair question to put out there in the world when we feel so again bedraggled. It's very hard to get out of bed. We feel kind of stuck in our dystopian loop. So many of us talk about that, and our experience of the present right now is living in a dystopia. And part of what the speculative fiction of Octavia Butler does, and part of what Adrienne Maree Brown's book does, is it starts from that place of dystopia, which is a realist space. And it moves us to, and asks us to imagine the forms, to time travel to some future or some ideation of what we can accomplish. I actually think, Madin, about one of the aspects of Project Q that seems almost the most fictional or science fictional, whatever, is the hair stream. And you alluded to it briefly when you were discussing one of the things that you sort of started up, but could you explain to us what the hair stream is and what you used it for, what you've done with it, and how you've taken it around the country and encountered people and maybe changed your perspectives on what the United States and different parts of the country were like?
Yeah, I would love to. It's interesting to say that we did this, US-wide tour during a hard part of our, US history, but because every day kind of feels like it's a hard part of our US history. But we went on tour a week after Brett Kavanaugh was signed into office. And so there was this error already, that had been building for a long time. And so it's myself, my wife, and a good friend of ours, 3 Black queer people driving around middle America in an Airstream trailer that's also a salon with a bearded lady painted on the side of it doing free haircuts. We did free haircuts outside of the Westboro Baptist Church as a sign of resistance. We did free haircuts outside of the Brown versus Board of Education school. We did free haircuts outside of all of these really impactful spaces. And all along the way, I was terrified, especially knowing what this world can be. But the hair stream in itself is a transformative space. I've purchased 3 different Airstreams. This is my 3rd one. We built it into our salon, and we were able to utilize it for a space to take the youth out of the shelter. Oftentimes that was the entire point, was to change their view and show them what they might be able to have. What's interesting about the trailer is that I created it. Oh, thank you, Karen. I made it so that we could, have somewhere for the youth to go and experience. But all in all, when I needed a space to work, it was there for me as well. So Karen, you've gotten your haircut on the Hairstream, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
That's what I started to realize at Echo Park Lake. I was able to park it right there. And what's interesting is that, especially understanding gentrification and inequality and, systemic racism and all of the ways that it was going to be difficult for us to grow in the way that I wanted to, without having to jump to the next step, without thinking about what it is that our next step would be. The Hairstream held us just the way that we created it to hold others. And so, it's really interesting though. Yes, you can see it. You can see it here. This picture that you're hovering over is, I was doing haircuts in a queer church in Kansas City, Missouri for an ACLU rally. And this young person was just beaming with pride at how they got to be viewed, and sitting in a space in my parents' hometown that I was taught was very Christian and very unapproving of queerness, to then be there in a church and giving positivity to folks was such a beautiful experience. And so that's really what Project Q has done, but the trailer itself, because I can move it to different areas and go to Tennessee and go to Atlanta and be in these places that are historically terrifying, and be able to show up as I am, and other people to be able to see me and feel like they can live their own lives. That was why we wanted to go on tour. And Octavia Butler talks, a lot of her books, she's moving in the books, right? She's never really staying still. But what's happening is that she's never, just to speak back to the quote from page 19, she was, none of her main characters are ever born heroes. She has to make, every character has to make themselves into the main character of their story and into the heroes. And that Project Q has helped me do that in my own life. It's our own work that we have to do.
And I mean, I think that it's also important to remember, like when speaking to the fact that, yeah, nobody is predetermined, predestined, fated, right, to greatness in a particular way, as we see in so many hegemonic narratives or stories. And one that's also brought out in the way Brown emphasizes, as particularly in on page 103, and it's a chapter on the non-linear and iterative. And the idea of understanding experience, understanding progress, and understanding collaborations, development as something that's non-linear, as something that will see its setbacks, that may move in these zigzag lines. It's never, like, we think of progress, we think of the word progressive, we think of what we imagine that means. And we so often sometimes catch ourselves using phrases like, well, back then things were not so great. Every time that I get a paper, whether at whatever level, undergraduate or graduate level, there's this assumption that somehow we progressed beyond the way certain things were. But a key thing to remember, and one of the key aspects of forging a strategy for emergence, for change, and for possibility, is to relinquish the idea that we make linear progress, that we, because think about it, even in the kind of season of protests that we've experienced this summer so far, the surge of bodies in the movement, in the kind of displays of solidarity and strength that we experienced in the wake of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's death, you would hope and imagine that some progress would be achieved from that. And yet we find ourselves again looped into the circularity and repetition, the nonlinear, the iterative repetition of a thing that, in recent events, of a thing that, like, we wish that we'd progressed beyond. And so I think that one of the best things about Emergent Strategy, and one of the best things that you modeled for us in the way you were describing your own process, Madin, is to remember that and see how we forge resilience, how we recover and transform based on that. And that's like, those are the strategies that the book really offer to us, because, it's easy. It's funny because there are things about this book that, feel so intuitive, right? And, and that just speak so resonantly with me, and that it's surprising that, so some of it just almost feels like it's, not necessarily a set of step-by-step endeavors to get to somewhere, but in fact, it produces that as well. So I don't know, I wonder if you want to comment a little bit, Madin, on some of the different pragmatic bits of advice that you've seen from the book, that you've managed to transpose into action or into a way of being and framing a project that's meant to help people in their development and growth.
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, Adrienne is like she says it like very, very early on and throughout the book, that she doesn't have all of the rules. She doesn't know all of the answers. She's literally just learning as she goes along and leaning on her support systems in order to bring her through. And that's really what we have to do every single day. what's interesting is that I'm a very nonlinear person. I don't know if it's that I'm on all air sign or whatever the case may be, but you know, it's saving and reserving our energy for when things are not going to be okay, as opposed to trying to make things perfect. That is honestly, for me, it's the bottom line as to how we can grow through these times and grow through growth. For instance, you know, we've been also creating a product line through this time to try and have some type of income, but you know, we buy the jars, the glass jars, because there's a plastic shortage in California and the United States, so we have to buy glass. The caps don't fit, so we have to buy different jars. The caps on those don't fit. It's going to constantly, nothing's ever going to be perfect, especially as we're trying to create in a time of deficit. But this is the perfect time to recreate who we are. Also, again, and I can't stress this enough, but she talks a lot about figuring out who we are in this world. And that's my favorite part of it, is trying to figure out what is our role to play and how do we have to transform in order to be the people in the utopia, in the future that we are speculating. And I know that that's not an A, B, or C. It's not a step, but that is the only way in which we can create a different world, is to create ourselves as the people that we want to be when we get there. Yes, that's literally all that I can say about that, because it really does come down to all of our own, you know, implicit biases, right? I think that a lot of folks are doing a lot of work on implicit bias right now when it comes to their own, you know, diversity and equity and inclusion, all of that stuff within the organizations. But like, we have to deal with that inside of ourselves as well, and recognizing that as queer folks and as people of color, all of those messages were fed to us too. You know, everything that people learned about themselves and their superiority, we were also fed about how we were not superior. So I think that it takes a lot of time and learning to show up in a new world. I think that things are changing. One thing that you had mentioned is, you know, when we're talking about the most recent uprisings and we're talking about Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, now they have the no-knock rule. Now they've removed that and they've named it after Breonna Taylor. You know, she was murdered in her home because they did a no-knock. The cops did a no-knock, is what they were calling it, and entered her home. Now there's a law that says that cops can't do that anymore. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? It's not perfect. I still don't want them entering the home. Knock, no knock, right? But it's about implementing the little things along the way and tearing down the big statues along the way that I think are going to get us where we need to go.
Yeah, and there are, again, these modest plans for transformative justice. And in a way that's interesting, you know, the book, Emergent Strategy, encourages us to seek within ourselves and work on ourselves, but it also acknowledges that that alone will not accomplish the work that we need to accomplish, which is sort of where some of the neoliberal ideologies have stopped, right? Which is where certain US ideologies have stopped, is like, as an individual, you are responsible for fixing the problem just as a department, or like as one unit, right? That you can solve everything. What you know, you have to start from there and you have to be able to begin the work from there. But you need the coalition, you need a fractal relationship, as she calls it. Also a constellated relationship to elders, to younger people across generations, in collaboration sometimes with structures and people who are abusive, right? In order to find transformation and transformative justice. She, in the chapter on resilience on page 135, you know, that she's discussing the Young Women's Empowerment Project and her friend Shira Hassan, and the different ways in which, you know, like she quotes at length actually the feedback that Shira Hassan gave to her about the book. And towards transformative justice, as she says, there is a list. So lists, that's one of the things too that's impressive and that's kind of helpful. Like, you know, so often in theoretical books, especially those that ask us to transform our conceptual thinking, it can be alienating. It can be in a language that's not accessible. And it can be almost excessively theoretical to the extent that we don't know what to do. And even just a few bullet points and a few numbers already feels like, hey, there's possibility I could do this. The steps are there, right? So the list here on page 135, transformative justice, 1, acknowledges the real state of harm, the reality of state harm, the reality of state harm, which we live through, experience daily. 2, it looks for alternative ways to address and interrupt harm, which do not rely on the state. And that, as you may know, alludes to what we call mutual aid. We've been calling mutual aid in community contexts. 3, relies on organic creative strategies that are community created and sustained. 4, transforms the root causes of violence, not only the individual experience, right? So you may start from a place of individual experience, but you have to get to the root cause, the structural cause, those violences. And even thinking about number 3, relies on organic creative strategies that are community created and sustained. That's what I see Project Q having accomplished. Then I also see, one of the things that I find pretty inspirational in this moment is the emergence of these community fridges out in the world across Los Angeles. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that as well, but like people began setting up refrigerators where people could share their excess food, some of it cooked, some of it raw, and also certain supplies, hand sanitizer, hygiene supplies. And, for a moment, we let go of our fears around liability and the things that prevent us from helping each other out, right? There's so many things that tell us not to do that because we might get sued. We might, something might happen. But instead, I think that, we're experimenting with providing aid to each other beyond the harms that the state requires in order to provide that aid. So I think that that's really exciting. But also, I know that since the pandemic began, Madin, some of the mutual aid that Project Q has provided has also made those kinds of adjustments, right? Because initially Project Q as an endeavor was about providing skill sets to young LGBTQIA plus unhoused youth, teaching them how to cut hair, teaching them trades and skills, how to balance a checkbook, how to open a bank account, those sorts of everyday pragmatic gestures. But since you weren't able to be in community space or hold each other in community space, what are some of the things that you did? What are some of the adjustments that you made towards transformative justice during this catastrophic event?
Well, first I have to say that the first part is understanding that the pain is happening, right? And that was what we had to do. We had to pause and go, oh, this is hard. We don't know how to continue to give, especially because doing haircuts, right? And offering that as an understanding of a trading of currency for our youth. So what they were doing is they're coming in to get a haircut for free, and they're paying with their attention. And that's why we would teach them workshops on financial planning and nutrition on a budget, sexual empowerment, right? And so that was teaching them a bit beyond the dollar, right? That their energy is actually their most important and valuable resource, which is something that I don't think that we teach enough. So leaving that space of now we don't have this exchange that is bringing you in the door, how do we continue to teach that your energy is your most valuable resource, and learning that from someone that looks like you? And so one of the ways that we've been able to do that on our end is by, we've been driving around LA and dropping off food and hygiene boxes to the youth that we service. Sometimes at street corners, sometimes, in shelters, sometimes in, homes that are subsidized income. But that is the first way to say, we had to bring it back and say, I'm doing this because I think that your life matters. So I'm gonna feed you so that you can stay alive. We really had to come down to the basic need. And then offshooting from there, right? So going in the direction of long-term sustainability for some of these folks that have lost their entry-level jobs, realizing that we are all within working class individuals, and being able to offer online courses for haircutting coming in 2021. And so not only just online courses, but also once the pandemic gets to a normal place, however long that will be, a space for apprenticeship in a queer space that is affirming. And so what's interesting about that is a longer term. It's not it's kind of like the teaching someone to fish as opposed to giving them one. And that's how we've had to really, like the transform portion of the justice has to come into place. And realizing our entity, our space as its own living, breathing thing as well, that is also having to, kind of being suffocated in this moment. And how do we, we're in the chrysalis at the moment. That's where we are, and trying to figure out who are we going to be on the other end of that. And what we want is to be able to offer more sustainable resources that are going to help folks fish for themselves. And only in the way that we can. So taking it back to understanding, systemic racism, but also trying to make transformative moves within the spaces that we embody and that we hold, right? We can only change the things that are with it, that we have power over. And so for Project Q, being able to make that transition, it's only within what we know how to do. Right. So I know that, for instance, when it comes to those folks that are doing the food refrigerators, they're everywhere, by the way. They're not just in LA, they're everywhere. They're amazing. But what they're doing is they're taking it from, okay, I'm going to take a food to you, to now here's the food, you come to it, and having to switch the way that they think about things. Project Q will have to do the same, but we don't deal necessarily in food normally. A lot of doctors are now trying to, create mobile clinics where they can go to folks and treat them outside of a COVID space. That is what they have to offer. So I really do feel like so much of it is coming down to, what do I have to offer? Coming right back to that space. What do I give? What is my genius space? And then living from there.
Yeah, and I think that, a resonant quote from the book for what you just described, it's on page 150, for those of you following along. I want us to do better. I want to feel like we're responsible for each other's transformation. Not the transformation from vibrant, flawed humans to bits of ash, but rather the transformation from broken people and communities to whole ones. I believe transformative justice could yield deeper trust, resilience, and interdependence. All these mass and intimate punishments keep us small and fragile. And right now, our movements and the people within them need to be massive and complex and strong. And then she concludes by saying, I want to hear what y'all think and what you're practicing in the spirit of transformative justice. And on that note, I also want to hear what y'all think. Those of you who have joined us in this conversation, and about what you're practicing in the spirit of transformative justice towards wholeness and evolution and loves. But also, if you have any questions or comments or critiques to offer of what you read, or questions of Madin or questions of me, especially, it's really strange, to, at least I'll say from my perspective, to be in charge of a unit, to be the chair of a department, to do the work of leading something in a particular way. And I want to be able to imagine the way we do work at an academic department, at an institution, at a private one at that. I want to try to reimagine that together. And so I'm here to receive also input from you about what you want our work together as a community to accomplish. So feel free to unmute yourselves, raise your hands or not, or just kind of chime in if you want to comment and be a part of the conversation. And thank you, Madin. And feel free also to chime in more if there's more that you want to add. We're not completely done, obviously, with our conversation, but I do want to leave open the space for collaboration here.
I'll chime in here.
Sure.
I was like, it really resonated with me what you said, Madin, about And I think Karen, you brought this up as well, the kinds of risks that we have to take to organize mutual aid, right? That there is a kind of risk taking that an individual might be faced with. Those of you who are in here who know me know that some of the organizing that I've been most involved with over the last couple of years is around mutual aid in sex work communities and skill sharing within those communities. And oftentimes that work is criminalized because, you know, aiding other sex workers can be considered, you know, solicitation or even trafficking. And I think that we really need to kind of think about, like, you know, like what kinds of vulnerability, like, do I need to take on in order to get work done? And that's not the liberal model of organizing. And it's something that, you know, I just resonated with me when you were talking about it. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's all, that is a question, right? How, in what ways do we put ourselves on the line? And, you know, how do we measure that risk? And I think that the book itself, you know, sort of suggests different approaches to that, right? Like a kind of the increasing of risk in certain circumstances when you have the privilege and capacity to do so, certainly, but also understanding when, you know, one's intervention is necessary and there as a mode of survival. I mean, I think, you know, I think that one of the things that we're seeing, given the kind of collapse of any sort of sense of centralized governance or of the state helping out in any way, is a certain laxness even in the state structure around certain efforts towards mutual aid, or, you know, not just the kind of corporate philanthropic model, but people helping each other out. And I think, you know, like, without that eye on us, without that liability eye on us, we have the capacity to, you know, take these, you know, to use that risk and push towards a vision of the world we want to see better. I mean, I think that even institutionally, we can look here at USC and think about the Black at USC Instagram account, you know, and, you know, the risks that our students, you know, have taken in this moment to share their stories and to disseminate that. And frankly, the amount of pressure that that those students have enacted on the administration, on the university, has been more powerful and effective than a gazillion department chairs or faculty members, or a few individual ones scattered here and there, you know, complaining at various meetings, right? And so I think it is understanding the kind of risk-reward ratio to a certain extent, not just for yourself or your own benefit, but the risks and rewards for the greater good. And, you know, and I mean, I do appreciate that. It's something that constantly has to be weighed, including protesting in the middle of a pandemic. That's something that a bunch of us had to consider and think about, you know, being weighing our own vulnerability and susceptibility and our necessary presence in the streets at a given moment. But thank you for that, bringing that. Is there anything you wanted to say to that, Madin, or does anybody want to follow up?
Yeah. Hey, Chris, what's up? Long time no see. Yeah, so I wanted to say a little bit about that. It's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about how support and control play a role within the nonprofit industrial system. And we think about mutual aid, especially when it comes, you know, government aid. It's all about quantifiable growth and income, right? They want to know, this is why we're dealing with the census right now. They want to know how many people are helping, and they want to know how much so they can put the money where it needs to go. And it's all about bureaucracy. But the bending that's happening right now within a lot of those spaces, it's the gushy part. It's like the best part. Similarly, Chris, I did try last year into this year, I was actually trying to work on a program specifically for self-defense for sex workers, and, like, you know, arming folks with not just like their body, like we were breaking down, like, this is how you arm your body. This is what you need to keep on you at all times. This is what you need to do if this happens, right? And it can come down to looking as though it is, it's solicitation and it's an invitation. but it's being swept under the rug, and that erasure that has consistently happened at the intersections of so many of us that have kept the systems in power. And also understanding that their support is their power. The fact that they are supporting us is the way that they are able to quantify us, and then that they continue to have the information on how they're supporting us and tracking us, and that is the power, right? So it's like, it's a long-winded way of saying, I'm only understanding this now, you know, a few years into our own nonprofit as we're growing. And this side of my board is saying, like, yes, we need to grow in these ways because we need to get, you know, structurally foundation so that we can apply for grants. And then on the other end saying, like, no, I'm 2 steps away from being a gutter punk. Like, why are we doing it this way? But understanding that there's somewhere in the middle. And right now is the time to kind of pull at those like bars, I believe. I've found that a lot with trying to even create the free barber school. The bureaucracy set up in there is, it's from start to finish. The same people make the books and write the books that teach the school, that send the tests, that make the kits, that give you your license. And so if I'm trying to break into that right now, I think that it's the time, since we can't be in person and there's so many things that are going to have to change. And, you know, as activists in the way that we are and in our own rights, I know that we all have our foot on the neck ready for it to pop, so.
Yeah, you know, and that's one of the things too that about the book Emergent Strategy, and one of the things that's impressive about what Adrienne Maree Brown is doing as an extension of this book, and just the work in the world that she's doing is, you know, she's holding workshops and sessions and you know, means for figuring out how to build differently, how to build organizations differently, how to, not even using the word build, right? How to also transform the way that we engage or conduct business with each other, and how people exist or coexist in the kind of work structures or organizational structures that they're in. Also, I wanted to make sure that if you feel uncomfortable asking a question vocally or expressing that way, you feel free, if you are able, to type a question into the chat function or a comment. So that's, I'm not sure if everyone's enabled to chat, but I hope everyone is. I think that you know, they are. But are there any other comments or questions, contributions?
I'll chime in.
Yeah.
Hi. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of reading this book, and also apologies if you hear a baby crying relatively soon. She's outside, but she may come inside. It may get loud. But one of the things I've been thinking about recently is at what point I not kind of tamped down my ambition, but at what point, like, I think there's certain choices that I've made in my life in terms of my career and kind of where I am based on the kind of life that I wanted to be and what would work for my mental health. And now, you know, in terms of thinking about being the change that I want and imagining a different future. So part of it is stepping out of my comfort zone, right? And the space of safety. And then part of it is also a fear of embracing that fire or ambition that I know is in there, but that I don't know if I've been socialized or for keeping peace, and also a cat, but for the sake of keeping peace, at what point I have chosen to kind of, I don't know, to tamp down my voice and my ambition. I don't know if this makes sense, but in reading what she was talking about, imagining the possibility and being that, it just makes me wonder, but also you don't want to be the kind, you know, you don't want to be the one or the hero of whatever. Like, there has to be a coming together and a consensus and a working together in a community. So I'm just thinking about, how do you bring a community together, and how do you And I think part of it is, as a woman of color, just, you know, I will speak, but I'm also always wanting to keep that harmony. And at what point have I just shut myself down to be, I don't know, to maintain the harmony? I feel like I'm just thinking through this myself. But it's something that, in reading this book and realizing that embracing that part of me doesn't mean embracing, and even if it is embracing ego, that's okay. If you do it mindfully.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that there are different approaches. Like, thank you so much, Atiya, for, like, you know, bringing that and bringing legitimate, like, I think that one of the things about emergent strategies also would suggest, like, we don't have to come fully formed ever to, like, our sense of what, you know, we're trying to get, and you know, including our understanding of ourselves, right? It's one that develops, it's in process. But actually, I wanted to throw some version of that question to Madin around, you know, the extent to which, how does one both lead and be attuned to the community, to, you know, to the people who you are responsible for and responsible with? Because I think that, you know, as we've seen, power, leadership, in and of itself is its own desideratum. It's its own, you know, a corrupting force in a way. But we do need people to emerge. We do need people to emerge and to lead. And so how do you balance, you know, being the person who founded an organization, leading a community and being a part of that community as part of your practice?
It's definitely a delicate dance. I know exactly what you're speaking to, as especially, you know, being someone, if folks know much about me, they know that I grew up in an abusive household, which is why I specifically work with previously homeless youth, because a lot of those folks are coming from foster care. So as someone that was raised in a space of, like, no, you need to shut up, you know, like an abusive home, an abusive space that was constantly silencing, there's this hope to never be the silencer, right? Like, it's almost the worst thing that you can say to someone that has been abused in that way. And so it is a delicate dance, but I've been in a lot of counseling and therapy, which is really helpful. And one of my counselors, who was a queer Black woman, said to me, you know, we were having this conversation, and I told her, like, I want to lead. I just don't want to be a dictator. I don't want to be a tyrant. Like, how do I do this? I don't know what to do. And she said, oh, Madin, go on and try. I'd love to see you try to be a dictator, because you don't have it in you. You know, at that point, you will just be leading. And it's so interesting, because I'm at that impasse now where so many things are shifting, and I'm like, I have to pick up these roles, you know, and some folks are saying, like, oh, you're being a little passive here, or, oh, you're being a little demanding over here. And it's just like, I don't care. We have to just get things done so that our work can be done, and then find that balance for ourselves. But also, I read something earlier today that isn't specifically from Emergent Strategy, but it definitely resonated within this process, not perfection space that she's talking about, of, like, never are you a failure, but you are in process. And the quote was around, you know, being in your own way. And the question was, like, why do I keep stepping in my own way? Why am I self-sabotaging? And the answer was, well, because if you sabotage, then you have a false sense of power that you'll know what will happen on the other end. And that, it hit me in the heart, because it's so true. When I'm quiet, I know what's going to happen, but I don't know what's going to happen when I speak up. And that's the scary part of that. But it's our comfort. It's comfortable, or else the structures that are in place wouldn't be here for so long. They would have been torn down long ago if people were comfortable with not knowing what's going to happen on the other end. But I don't know, as a non-binary person, it feels really nice to just be like, I don't know, I'm in the middle, there's fluidity.
Yeah. No, thank you for, like, contextualizing this. Yes, and thanks for your comment as well, Chris. We have about 7 minutes left to wrap up. And I think that I do want to draw your attention to a couple of small things. First, in the book, if you're interested in doing an emergent strategy facilitation, there is a guide at the end of the book starting on page 213. And, I think that that's, if any of you, especially in the gender and sexuality studies community here, are interested in trying that out together, and like maybe tackling a problem on campus that way together, we can try that. I think it would be really great, and it would be, um, a different way of approaching than the kind of hierarchical ways with which we have meetings and stuff like that. So I point you to it if you didn't get a chance to get to that part of the book. One of the things I love about the book too is that it encourages you to read non-linearly and in chunks and in bits and pieces. So hopefully that encouraged those of you who came here, and everybody else who got a copy of the book, to just engage with it and continue to engage with it as a manual throughout time. And I guess the closing quote that I want to end with and then invite reflection on is something that was also shared by Alexia Zambrano, really our our undergraduate student council member, GSS council member, and also a work study student in our department. And this is a quote that they pulled, which I thought was really striking. "There is an art to flocking, staying separate enough not to crowd each other, aligned enough to maintain a shared direction, and cohesive enough to always move towards each other." And I think that that's like a beautiful metaphor. Like, one of the things about the book is that it finds examples in the natural world, in nature, in science. It doesn't separate the mystical from the scientific. It doesn't, separate the sort of spiritual from those worlds. But it's a wonderful thing to think about flocking together, of moving together apart at certain instances, but being in that kind of semblance together. And on that note, and with that quote, I just sort of wanted to invite any closing thoughts from any of you, any wishes, incantations, imaginations you want to put out into the world, things that you want to speak into the world as a hope, as a possibility. Because I think that we need to have space for that. And instead of only asking questions and existing in the realm of expertise, I invite that from everyone here, that, to bring wishes to the table, to bring imagining to the table, because that's what we're going to need. So if any of you want to share that, either in the chat, or if you want to express it verbally, please feel free to do so. We have a couple of minutes to do that. And wishes can be very simple too, because from the simplest, smallest gestures or wishes or hopes can come the greatest transformations. Oh, I love that. I'm going to read a couple of things in the chat window. As Chris shared, remember that we are in someone else's imagination right now. I think Brown calls it a battle of imagination. We have to imagine otherwise, but there is an otherwise. And there is an otherwise, and we do need to revisit that. And especially in these moments where we find ourselves, in despair. And Elizabeth shared this, a horoscope from Chani Nicholas, which also, that would be a fun gender and sexuality studies reading group text to take on as Chani Nicholas's book from earlier in the year, and it's on their desktop. The last 6 months of 2020 ask you to unearth all the ways in which you have fallen for the ideology that espouses that your successes should come at the cost of anyone else's, or that anyone else's comes at the cost of your own. As you sit down at your desk each morning, pause for a moment to imagine what it would take to turn your industry into a dream job, or anything entering it, and for everyone already in it. Work from there. That is such an important place to start from, because I think that we see how destructive, at least in our national context and national discourse, the idea of winning and losing, winners and losers, has been. That our ultimate goal is to win over others, over and above. And the idea that we can share success, that our success is infectious, that someone else's success can be infectious to us and kind of inspire us, as opposed to making us feel paranoid or sad or upset or like we're not accomplishing enough. That's a really great, I think, idea to leave us with. Also, we got another one from Amy. Losing our imagination is a symptom of trauma. Reclaiming the right to dream the future. This has to be my practice with myself and with others. And I think that, those are really important words and ideas for all of us to take out of our time together today. Madin, I want to thank you again for being here and for being part of this conversation. It was really inspirational to me to actually get to talk at length and in depth with you about some of these things that come out in snippets when we used to spend time together in the chair, the therapy chair. But thank you so much again for everything that you do.
Thank y'all for having me. It was really wonderful to be in this space and talk with other folks that are trying to imagine a different world. Just to speak to imagination really quick, because I know that we're almost done, but imagination is play, and play is what you do when you feel safe. And so just creating our own safety in our own spaces and then being able to imagine, I think, is the first step.
Yes, may you all take these things with us. I hope we feel slightly less broken, I hope, even if for a fleeting moment, leaving this space. So thank you all very much. And stay tuned for other events that we have coming up. We will have a podcast, an audio story from our undergraduates coming out soon. That is a sort of resource of mutual aid and help, welcoming people back to USC in their own virtual way, but also offering resources for LGBTQ students and gender and sexuality studies students here on campus. And we'll be recording that tomorrow, and hopefully we'll have that available on our GSS website soon. So thank you all, and let's keep transforming together.